criminals. You know, we took many people off the streets of Washington, D.C. They're hardcore. They're not going to be good. In 10 years, in 20 years, in 2 years, they're going to be criminals. They were born to be criminals, and they're tough and mean, and they'll cut your throat, and they won't even think about it the next day. They won't even remember that they did it. And we're not going to have those people.
We all we got.
We all we need.
Coming together at the local,
We do not need occupiers.
and state levels.
When our administration first came on board and we said that we were going to take an all-of-the-above approach to public safety, that you were never going to militarize your way into safe streets.
On Friday evening, Governor Wes Moore and Mayor Brandon Scott walked through the streets of Baltimore's Park Heights neighborhood, the same neighborhood Mayor Scott grew up in.
None of us are celebrating and saying that we've solved gun violence. But what we are saying is that we, as a collective, have us in the best position that we have been in 50 years.
We all we got.
We all we need.
We all we got.
We all we need.
Hello and welcome back to Political Commentary Corner. I'm your host, Lawrence Grandpre. That, of course, is some audio from the recent back and forth between Mayor Brandon Scott, Governor Wes Moore, and the President of the United States, Donald Trump, about the proposed occupation of Baltimore by National Guard troops. Of course, now the National Guard is going to Memphis. And the discourse around sending him to Memphis was that Memphis has a higher crime rate than cities like Baltimore, and we don't need him in Baltimore because the crime rate is down so much. But the question is why? And I think that this episode is centering on the answer to that question and how it engages narratives around policing and the National Guard. Because if the answer is it's down because of, as the governor said, the all-of-the-above approach, which includes violence prevention, the prosecutors, chiefs and sheriff, and police, then why not have some more National Guard? Because more is better if it's all of the above. This is opposed to the sounds you heard about people chanting, "We're all we got, we all we need." And the community anti-violence walk, where the governor and the mayor made these remarks, was hosted by an organization whose name is not mentioned in the news report. And that organization is We Are Us, an organization that we support that mobilizes multiple variety of faith organizations and cultural, spiritual approaches to violence prevention that we believe are the real reason why violence is down. So when the governor says all of the above, and the mayor says gun violence reduction strategy, GVRS, this constant refrain, what do those words mean? Because the governor and the mayor consistently make it out, and sometimes even the right-wing critiques of the governor and the mayor, that GVRS means violence prevention, means We Are Us, means grassroots alternatives to heavy-handed policing tactics. This podcast is designed to interrogate that because I think in reality, when you study GVRS, the logic behind the policing portions of GVRS, which are the majority of what is actually GVRS, as opposed to grassroots violence prevention, actually mirrors the logic of the people wanting to send the National Guard to cities around the country. And we have to be able to critique gun violence reduction strategy and not accept the argument that it is a public health alternative to heavy-handed policing in order for us to make the argument as to why we don't need the National Guard and to make grassroots violence prevention not depend on investments in policing like GVRS in order for us to prove that we don't need the National Guard or heavy-handed policing tactics, be it the state troopers or any other folks occupying our community. So again, please check us out on lbsbaltimore.com. Please like and subscribe and give a rating to this podcast. This is a new podcast, so if you give the ratings on Apple Podcasts, it'll really help us in the algorithm. Please check out the other shows on the Black Liberation Media Network and the Black Liberation Media page. Please sign up to their Patreon, and we thank you for engaging this new addition to the LBS podcast family. With that, let's get started.
Two, three, drop it.
Just because the Guard isn't coming eminently to Baltimore does not mean Trump may not try to send them in the future. So I want to start this episode with giving some talking points to help deconstruct the logic behind sending the Guard as a setup to how we understand the value of violence prevention, to conclude by arguing that GVRS, rather than the tool to foster grassroots violence prevention, may actually be a tool to hinder it. So it's important to understand that when Trump says he wants to send the National Guard, he's saying that the black folks in this city are screaming for something to be done about crime, and that the liberals and the lefties can't hear those people. And though this occupation does not poll well, they continuously lean back on this argument around the real people on the ground are calling for something to be done. So it's just a small sample of the voices on the ground. As some folks know, Don Lemon actually parachuted into Baltimore when it was perceived that the National Guard occupation was imminent, and did man and woman on the street interviews in Baltimore, actually on Pennsylvania Avenue. So I want to actually play a little bit of the audio from interviews Don Lemon did on Pennsylvania Avenue and use that to actually explain specifically why grassroots violence prevention is a tool to address the fear and concerns that lead people to support Black grassroots working class people to support potentially a National Guard occupation to deal with crime. So let's actually listen to Don Lemon, and let's unpack that, and we'll talk a little bit more about what specifically grassroots violence prevention is and why it's uniquely positioned to respond to the specific concerns of working class Black people when it relates to crime. So here's Don Lemon.
Wow. Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. You're more than welcome.
Thank you very much. Sir, how you doing? Can I ask you something? The president said he wants to send armed people here, the National Guard. What you think?
I don't care.
You don't care?
I don't care.
At all? Doesn't matter, right? You think that Baltimore needs the help?
Baltimore definitely needs some help. Look around. Look around. We definitely need help. City crazy.
Yeah. How's the crime around here?
I don't know. I just moved around here. I ain't finished right here.
Thank you. How y'all doing? Hey, how are you? Can I ask you a question?
Yes, sir. What's going on?
Good to see you. The president wants to send armed troops here, National Guard. What'd you say?
No.
He said no. What do you say?
Armed troops. What is the primary purpose of him sending armed troops?
Well, you know what he says about Baltimore, but
I understand, but you know what? The process of dealing with armed troops, and you have peace officers right here already. You know what I mean? So what is that agenda is going to do, whereas though that is going to cause any kind of less strife, division, and contention in the city of Baltimore? This is a prevalent disease of a crisis that's broad, far, and wide. I am a pre-recovery coach. I work in the field of substance abuse. You got to look at whereas though in the spirituality piece, am I my brother's keeper? Whereas though it has gotten out of hand now, you need all the city officials, all the dignitaries in Annapolis, even in the Oval Office, to come together with all the ammunition they can find to have different types of programs that will subsidize this disease of addiction.
you don't think having more people on the street, armed protests, going to help?
What it's going to do? It's going to minimize maybe the crime, right? That's reflecting from substance abuse.
But it's not going to take care of the root problem.
It's not going to take that underline. People are going to do what they do for survival. You know what I mean? By any means necessary, which I call a Malcolm X syndrome. By any means necessary.
I appreciate you talking to me. Thank you. Okay. Ma'am, do you think they should send troops?
Yes, I do.
Why?
Because, like he said, I mean, it's like survival to fitness around here. You know, people getting killed. You know, these kids out here, they're not respecting their parents. They just talk to their parents any kind of way, and that's really not fair. Not fair to the parents because these kids are disrespectful out here. You know, they cursing at you. Even I noticed this morning when I was getting on the bus to go over to a meeting. I know that the kids wouldn't let the elderly sit down. They make them stand on the bus. That's very ignorant. They should have respect. I was taught saying yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am. You know, I was taught where though kids would be seen but not heard.
Yeah, so you're in favor of sending armed troops here to help?
I mean, if that's what y'all need to do, go for it.
Yeah.
You know, we need a change.
Yeah.
We really need a change.
Yeah.
So it may not come as a surprise to folks listening to the podcast. I'm not the biggest fan of person on the street interviews because people have been so beaten down by white supremacy in the media environment that when you come to them and you say, would you like something to be done to change your community? They say, yeah, something has to change. And the first person who was interviewed first says, I don't care. But then as Don Lemon keeps pushing him, it's like, yeah, I guess we need something. This shows the manufacturing consent, the claiming that there's actually a grassroots mandate for these kind of interventions is really an extension of the enforced hopelessness in these communities. Again, this is Pennsylvania Avenue, the same community where Bilal Abdullah was shot and killed. The same community where it wasn't just neglect, but it was intentional evisceration of community by urban renewal that caused mass incarceration because they actually invested in Pennsylvania Avenue and sent the police to quote-unquote protect the investment. But none of that history is brought up. And all you see is the results of mass incarceration, the results of predatory inclusion of federal urban renewal policy. And then you say, well, I guess we need more. I guess we need something, right? And this is the historical context we need to push back against the arguments that people are demanding for the National Guard or the state troopers or the BPD to surge into our communities. Because what they're really saying is that something has to change, and they're not being told who's doing the work to change the conditions on the ground. So I think that the last person interviewed, the woman, really shows the cultural context behind the perception that something is wrong in that community. She's not even really talking about crime. She's talking about the abstract concept that the youth don't respect the elders. And again, you can call that people being old or propaganda or watching too much Fox News, but if there's a real sense that youth losing a sense of moral compass and guidance is what's causing crime, then doesn't it make sense to invest in programming intentionally designed to harness the culture and resources of African people, to engender a sense of respect for community, for elders, and for themselves in community upstream, not just the shooters, not just for the people who are adjacent to the street and carrying guns, but for the entire community to have reparative programming, to give them context to explain the intentional political, psychological, and social attacks on community, so that young people can look at the community and not say, our elders failed us, look at the community around us, but can have context to explain the work that elders have done that has been hidden by a media system and a school system refusing to actually cover the work that's being done. Again, just the clips I showed you today, they don't even mention the organization that sponsors the walk where the governor and the mayor are speaking. So the lady in this clip wouldn't even know that there are people doing community walks consistently, giving people connections to addiction treatment, as the second person who was interviewed talked about the need for all hands-on-deck response to addiction, and doing that comprehensively within a violence prevention framework. So that's part of the work of We Are Us. Again, grassroots violence prevention is people working through the entire community, having consistent conversations with people who are on the streets. Maybe they sell drugs, maybe they don't. Maybe they're in community doing work, or maybe they're just outside because that's nothing to do and they want a friend group. Gathering the information, scanning for conflicts, being able to mediate conflicts. So much of the violence in our community, a study by the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement says that over 50% of violent crimes, murders in this community are not from drug dealing, not from beefs over corners, not from intentional hits, but varieties of interpersonal conflict that get out of hand. And the fact that we've cut the murder rate 50% in this city by investing specifically in institutions that have a cultural context to mediate that conflict, I think is very, very important. And the fact that people don't know it, the fact that people like Don Lemon interviewed don't know that's what's happening because the media wants to focus on Trump versus the mayor and the governor and not the people on the ground doing the work. So we're going to focus a bit on the people on the ground doing the work. So we're going to play a clip from some of the individuals involved in the creation and the work of We Are Us. Again, We Are Us is one of many organizations doing the work in community to disrupt this conflict. And I just want you to hear some of the ways that they frame their response, because I think it is a good juxtaposition to arguments around why we need policing, National Guard, state troopers, and indeed some of the policing from GVRS, which again claims to be operating in the name of grassroots violence prevention. So here is some of the brothers from We Are Us talking about their work.
Brother Andrew Muhammad, We Are Us Executive Director and Co-Founder. We started this organization in 2018, basically to stop the violence and the shootings and the killings in our city. So we just connected with leaders around the city and faith-based leaders, brothers in the street, Muslims, Christians, and just black men in general. We wanted to see a change in our city, and the brothers came together, and we've been rolling for 6 years ever since. But the number one goal was collaboration and resources.
Let me just say, I'm Andre Bundling, co-founder of We Are Us. But what I want to just lift up is how can you get all of these individuals who are talented in their own right, who have their own organizations, give up some of that time, that talent that they have, and work for a larger organization to be able to ensure that the umbrella organization, We Are Us, continue to exist even while those individuals with that talent continue to build out their organization.
So with the foundation that was laid, it was already planted 4 major pillars, which was to protect, connect, mediate, and message. And that was critical to foundational, that everything we do are in those 4 pillars. And so that foundation was laid by the founders, even when it was in the Mayor's Office of African American Male Engagement. Then when we became its own 501c3, those foundations continued to move out throughout the community. EB, who right here was key to mediating some critical beefs. So you want to talk about the Stop the Beef program?
I've been doing this work for 27 years in the inside, and came out, walked out the prison gate and walked straight into the walk of We Are Us. and once again started working with young people in the city and realized it was a difference working with young people in society than it was in prison. And so I had to be retrained all over again with working with young people, and that's what We Are Us done for me. It trained me over again, helped me to start what is now the peace team, and the governing factors of it, and how to maneuver my way through all the things that you have to go through when you're just a grassroots organization. And so they really trained me up. And so this is what We Are Us, a factor that's really not talked about is how much they give to smaller organizations in building us up.
That Pastor Coy always remind me of is the foundation with some of the data that me and Doc looked at back in 2018 when Baltimore had 309 murders. 275 of the murders was black men, and 175 of the murders was headshots. So we took that data, and what that data did for us, it gave us some goals, and there's some areas to focus on in regards to the murder and the violence. So you gotta have goals, and then you gotta push through them goals and make sure that you keep that out in the front. Because if you get away from that, then you can mismanage what you're doing. Yes, sir.
Take 30 more seconds and talk about how you all met.
Okay. Oh, yeah. So it's a funny story because the organization started in 2018, but in 2015, literally our city was on fire. So we all came out to the police station, and we were out there. The young people, one of the guys, Major Russell, let the nation know, let us know, said, as long as they stay on that side, we don't have to arrest them. But your job is keep them on that side. As long as they don't come on outside, they're fine. And so Kat was over there, I was out there. We didn't know each other's name, but that was the day that I believe divinely God breathed on this work and said, you know what, this is going to go around the nation to help the nation. And that's how it started, and we didn't even know each other's names. So that was just an amazing moment in 2015. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So there's a lot in that clip. I'll try to be as brief as I can be unpacking what I hear, because I hear an alternative narration of the history of Baltimore and its fight against gun violence and violent crime. And I hear a counter-narration that's actually really well designed to respond to the narrative we need the National Guard. So what happened was that in 2015, the National Guard came. We know the police blocked off the station at Mondawmin, young people get home. That helped instigate the Baltimore uprising, the property destruction we saw. When you treat young people like animals and they see people being attacked and disrespected by police and authority figures, that causes them to lash out. That causes disconnection, distrust in our community that actually seeds violence. So the people in We Are Us partially met each other, as stated, during the uprising. And that created connections between the Nation of Islam, black churches, people in academia, people in the city, government, people in philanthropy, that created institutional capacity, as they said, building 501c3s, retraining people into how we do this work to disrupt violence. People behind the walls came home with credibility, but also got retrained. It's not magic. There's intentional institution building and training specifically to think about violence within the context of the internalized self-hatred that leads black people to kill other black people. Amos Wilson, professor at City University of New York, talked about violence in the black community, externalization of a suicidal impulse. So when Captain Andrew talks about the murders being black men and so many of them being headshots, that's his nod to what it takes to take someone who looks like you, a face that looks like yours, and to shoot that person in the head, intentionally killing them. Again, this isn't random street crime. This is intentional attacks of black men against black men. So you need intentional cultural and spiritual interventions into that internalized self-hatred. Now, again, part of the issue with violence prevention is that when you're mediating street beef, it is confidentiality and a code of silence to the highest degree. Because you're mediating conflicts with individuals who may be involved in illegal activity, and you're dealing with threats and people of the most highest sensitive nature. So they don't talk about the work that they do, or they talk about it only in abstractions. But I'll just talk about some of the things I've seen. I've seen them take groups of kids and have food giveaways and talk about, in the African village, when the village is under attack, it's the responsibility of the young soldiers to feed the community, to protect the community. And that's not just giving food away, that's taking young people who may be socialized to see their community as individuals that they're supposed to prey upon, and put them in the position of provider for their community, and basically make a commitment to that community that I've fed you, I've taken care of you, so now it's harder for me to see myself as a predator upon the community. specifically within the context of African-centered cultural, racial, historical analysis. And these are the sort of interventions that have been done consistently on the ground, building institutional capacity for these people to take money from local philanthropy and local government to be able to scale up to do the work, facing the headwinds of the fentanyl coming to Baltimore in 2018-17, facing the headwinds of the uprising 15-16, facing the headwinds of the pandemic, all of which increased violence in our community. When those winds started to shift, and when we started to get money from the federal government and local government to actually invest in these folks, we've seen a decline in violence that's never been matched by anything the National Guard has done. Again, the National Guard came in 2015, unleashing the worst violence our community has ever seen, because they occupied our community and taught our young warriors that they were under attack. We've tried focused deterrence. We've tried broken windows. We've tried hotspots. None of that has led to a 50% decline in shootings that we see today. And it is because we have specific programs designed to interrupt the sort of cultural, spiritual roots of the interpersonal conflict that is driving so much of the violence here today. So not only do we have a story about violence prevention working, we have a story that directly juxtaposes that to the idea that we need policing or National Guard to work to stop violence in our community. So now that we've analyzed We Are Us, I actually want to play a clip from another violence prevention professional in our community, Erica Bridgeford, and her work with Baltimore Ceasefire, now known as the Baltimore Peace Movement, to both explain some of the context of what they do and also introduce this concept of ceasefire, what it used to be called GVRS, and what it's known as now, and maybe begin to see some of the potential tensions between some of the things that ceasefire, peace movement, We Are Us is doing, and these policing-centric interventions, which she calls ceasefire, and I argue has evolved into GVRS. So let's hear Erica Bridgeford on Breakfast Club talking about her work. This is also an interview done with the mayor, who we'll hear from next.
This guy named Ogun, who had this idea about calling a ceasefire, because he just, he watching the news and he sees what's happening in Israel and occupied Palestine and keeps hearing the word ceasefire. So he wanted Baltimore to have that same kind of like introspection, but also eyes on it from the outside. So he had this idea that there would just be one day where everybody agreed in Baltimore, it's going to be a ceasefire. In 2017, the city had more murders than it had ever had in its history, which pissed me off because I had been out doing work all day long, the mediation center, I've been doing that work forever. And so I'm mad, like, how the fuck is this what's happening when we doing this much work? And they like pointing, the people who say they got connection to the gangs, why don't they tell niggas to stop shooting? Because if they say it, it's gonna happen. The next day when I woke up still that mad about it, I realized that I was they. I'm mad about what people not doing. And I hadn't followed through on this man's idea from 2 years ago. So I called him up and was like, what you say you wanted to do? Because God put on my heart, it shouldn't just be one day, it should be 3 days, and violence is a language, so if we taking violence, we got to replace it with something. Let's tell people, do stuff to celebrate life, because if nobody deserves to celebrate life, Baltimore does. At first, we were just calling it a life over death weekend, and to Brandon's point about the last program that was the GVRS, it had been called a ceasefire. And all the streets knew it to be was the police come and lock you up. So when we held this community meeting to ask, what do we name this life over death weekend? People were like, well, if you call it Baltimore ceasefire, people know what that means. And we put a sister component of the peace challenge, because this is not just about shooters. It's about who you being petty with in your own family, who you dragging on social media. Like, can you be peaceful for 3 days as a challenge to yourself? But we were worried that because it would be called ceasefire, it would get confused with the previous city program. In 2022, it occurred to me that the way creation actually works is whatever you focus on, your attention on with intense emotion, that's what you're going to manifest physically. So we're calling it ceasefire and we're paying so much attention to what we're against. We're not putting that energy on what we're for. Because when you redirect your focus to what you're for, you don't give a fuck about what you're against. You like, this is about what I'm for, what I'm standing on. So we asked Baltimore, what do you know already exists here? What are you for? What do you want for yourself? And from different places, the ideas came, it should be Baltimore Peace Movement.
So again, so much going on there. What I hear is, again, a fundamentally spiritual vision of the work that is seeking to engage the entire community. So not just the people who are adjacent to violence, but the peace challenge. Can you not drag people on social media? Again, an evidence-based methodology, now that we know that over 50% of conflicts are driven by interpersonal conflicts. Again, not this archetype of the black drug dealer, people beefing for corners. A consistent focus on spiritual awakening and framing it as energy and intentionality and intensity from the community around the positive concept of peace. The idea of the ceasefire, again, interestingly coming from an international perspective of seeing Baltimore akin to occupied Palestine, something we'll come back to later. And lastly, I want to talk about the concept of ceasefire getting confused with a city government program called ceasefire. Again, this is now Baltimore Peace Movement, but it used to be Baltimore Ceasefire, which is distinct from the program she was talking about that they potentially were afraid of getting confused with. The Baltimore City has tried this ceasefire program multiple times. And here's what ceasefire is. Ceasefire comes from this idea of a focused deterrence model that is typically associated with cities like Boston, where the idea is you take people who are known to be adjacent to the street, you use your evidence to figure out who they are, the shooters are, you get them in a room and you say, hey, I know you're on the streets. If we catch you with an illegal gun or we catch you shooting someone, we're going to throw you under the jail. And we know who you are. So you ain't getting away with it. But here is a pastor. Here's a mother whose son was killed. Change your life. Take these services. Get off the street. Baltimore has tried this program multiple times, and every single time it has failed. And the argument was they just didn't pump enough money into services, job creation, things like that. So now Baltimore is essentially trying the same program again and calling it the Gun Violence Reduction Strategy, or GVRS. So here's again Brandon Scott talking about GVRS within the context of it being a kinder, gentler alternative, not locking everybody up. Only the people we know are outside, and framing it basically as we're going to give you a fair shot, we're going to reach out to you as a brother, and generally framing it as an alternative to the sorts of racist, old school, lock everybody up policing that Baltimore becomes so notorious for in the past. So here's the mayor on that same Breakfast Club episode.
It's about reimagining what public safety means, because for all of our life, they just said reducing crime is the sole responsibility of the police. But I want people to understand how that was never true, right? Mm-hmm. And you take Baltimore, a city that's roughly 600,000 people. At its height, our police department had 3,000 cops. 3,000 people can't keep 600,000 people safe, especially when they all don't work at the same time, right? So we have to do the investments in changing that, and we can do that. The mayor sets the tone for how the city works. So I came in and said, no longer are we going to just say, hey, it's all the police's responsibility. Every part of city government has to be a part of this. We passed a law that we have to have a comprehensive approach that's led by a health commissioner, and then direct the funding to go to other places. So when you look at the fact that we're now funding our community violence intervention work at the highest level that we've ever had, people that used to be in the streets, whether it's Safe Streets or the Brothers That We Are Us and all these other folks who go out and intercede in violence, and we're investing in them and allow them to do that, deciding that we weren't going to just continue down this path of just like, oh, if they black and outside, we just going to lock them up for anything. No. We're going to stand up what we call our group violence reduction strategy, which is the epicenter really of the movie, and say, we know who the people are who will most likely be the victim or perpetrator of violence. It's much like any other disease, right? Since my granddad had prostate cancer, when I go to the doctor, what did he test me for? So we identify those people, and we're going to give them a chance first. They actually get a letter directly from me that says, look, in Baltimore terms, just, yo, I know who you are. I know what you're doing.
I know where
this
you
is
at.
your chance. I know where you live. I know everything about what you do. I'm telling you, this is your chance to change your life. If you need housing, if you need to finish school, if you need, mental health, whatever you need, we'll give it to you. But don't try to call my bluff, because if you call my bluff, then them boys coming, and you won't be able to say no one tried to help me. Yeah. And it's working, and we decided that we were going to put historic amounts of money into our rec centers. When we were growing up, they were closing them left and right? Because the mayor decided that's the focus, right? And that's what we have to do in every city, is have people in those positions that will do what's, as I always say, the right thing, not the popular one, because there are a lot of things that I did that people were like, I can't believe you didn't do that. We have to do the notifications, because if not, it's no different than us just showing up. And we use what we call credible messengers to go and deliver that message and say, look, they want to give you a chance, and people change their life. And I think,
so who you giving chances to? Is it shooters?
It's everybody. Everybody.
So you don't look at you like, look, you did this, you turn your life around, and you go locked up.
You're doing this stuff right now. We know that you're involved in activities that might end up having you lose your life or take someone else's life. This is your chance. Like, your group of people that you're with, chances are y'all ain't gonna be here, or you're gonna be locked up. That's the reality. We gotta tell people the real deal. And if they don't, like, take that heed. There are people that took it, right? There was a young man, it almost brought me to tears. We just had a little graduation for some folks through YAP on Saturday. This young man literally said that one young man had been out and on the street since he was 12. And no one ever asked him what he wanted to do or how he can do things different until our folks showed up. Now he works for the convention center. Saturday, a young man had told us he had been out of school since elementary school and out there doing what folks do, right? Now we got him on the right track. People are working for the city. People are starting their own businesses and being able to, because we also have to understand, like, look, we all know our people don't own boats, right? We don't own gun companies. We have to understand what's really happening in that cycle that we're allowing ourselves to be put in, and we're trying to pull people out of that as much as possible. But we can't just have people shooting and killing people, grandmothers and babies and kids and wives and all the other craziness. We just simply can't have that.
So I really want to take some time to try to unpack what the mayor is saying and recognize the mayor does make investments in grassroots violence prevention. But there's several issues with the way that he presents GVRS. So he talks about We Are Us as if it's part of the GVRS strategy. We Are Us does not work directly with police, and since GVRS is explicitly this focused deterrence framework, We Are Us is not really like the people delivering these so-called call-in letters. And that's important because people really support We Are Us. So the fact that he's using We Are Us to support GVRS is important because you can just fund We Are Us and not fund this GVRS component of the strategy that's failed multiple times already. Again, he explicitly calls it a public health alternative to the mass incarceration people associate with folks like Martin O'Malley. And it's important because, again, focused deterrence, when you actually listen to the people who are the proponents, as we will hear on this podcast, is not only not directly a public health approach to violence prevention, it is actually the criminologists, the people who are experts in the traditional racist academic discipline of studying communities as generating crime. It is their response in an attempt to essentially co-opt a lot of the language of public health and basically say, yes, violence is a disease, but we don't just need to actually focus on the root causes of the disease. We actually need to staunch the bleeding with policing and to have a more targeted intervention. It's like saying, let's put chemo only on the cancer as opposed to taking pills and have chemo start the whole body. So chemo pills that impact the whole body is lock them up, broken windows, O'Malley policing. Chemo that focuses on the tumor is a GVRS. This focused deterrence, lock them up, call in, send you the letter type of thing. The problem is that though the public health frame is seen as kinder and gentler, violence is a disease, you're still essentially viewing the community as a cancer, as the tumor that needs policing, as the corrective. You're not viewing them as We Are Us does, as many of the best examples of violence prevention throughout the country, the spiritual cultural practices of the Nation of Islam and the Black Church, or the Black Panthers. The concept of credible messengers comes from the anti-violence work done by veterans of the Black Panther Party in the 60s and 70s. The people that you call cancer are oftentimes, as we see with Bunchy Carter, as we see with Malcolm X, former street hustlers. The so-called cancer are often the cure. What you call a disease is oftentimes the medicine people need, and the best practices of public health, politically inflected, culturally inflected violence prevention, says let's not pathologize your righteous indignation. Let's not pathologize or treat as a disease your desire to go out on the streets and feed your family. Let's turn it into a righteous indignation at the system and people who are preventing you from taking care of your family and living a dignified life. So if you look at Newark, New Jersey, they have this thing like a ceasefire for the streets, don't kill your brother, mediate conflict, but also a ceasefire for the suites, i.e. the corporate suites. You will not gentrify the hood. You will hire returning citizens, and we will redirect some of the lateral aggression by Black people that's internalized against racism and white supremacy, that gets backlash against Black people out towards political engagement with the system of power and violence that's hurting you and your family in the first place. That is not what Baltimore's GVRS is doing. Despite everything Brandon is saying, all his rhetoric about caring for people, turning their life around, that is not what we're doing. We are not following the best practice of someone like Newark, who cut their murder rate 65% over the past decade and have kept the rate that low despite the pandemic increasing violence almost everywhere else. We're not following the best practice. We're not following the public health approach. We are following explicit criminological targeting of community, and explicitly a strategy that sees itself not in alignment necessarily with the radical social justice demands of the movements of 2020, the movements that Brandon wants to signal that he is in alignment with. But if you listen to the actual person who is being brought to Baltimore to help evaluate We Are Us themselves and help consult on the construction of our GVRS strategy, he sees what they're doing as a way to defend policing against the calls to defund the police. As Brandon said, we have a smaller police force than we have in the past, but the budget goes up and up and up. And once you get that investment going in, it's like you can never get it away. Because if crime goes up, they say, oh, the cops need more money. Crime is going up. Crime goes down. Oh, the police is working. So we can't defund the police. Why would you defund them? They're being successful. And it's not nightstick twirling racist big fat white guys that are sucking up the police budget. It is the people they are hiring to execute this so-called kinder, gentler GVRS strategy. These are college-educated young liberals, for the most part, who are working in getting the federal grants, doing the compliance, doing the technology, scanning social media. That's sucking up the police budget, because now the police get to claim, as Brandon is saying, they are a social service entity. You could just give the money to We Are Us directly. You could just give the money to Peace Movement directly. But instead, we have this strategy where the police get to suck up the energy and the veneer, the image of being a violence prevention organization, and is literally by design. So we're actually going to listen to some comments from, again, this is a real person. This is not like some academic who's dead. This is a real dude who's at University of Pennsylvania. He is being brought into Baltimore right now to consult on the construction of our GVRS strategy, and he explicitly, in his writings, his context, claims to not be public health. He is a criminologist by training. He is defending not just criminology in the abstract, but specifically the idea that we have to engage cops, talk to cops, work with cops, and use policing as a tool to stop violence. So this is Anthony Braga from University of Pennsylvania talking about his feelings about basically the movements of 2020 have gone too far. We have critiqued police too much. We have critiqued criminology too much. And he sees his work as a defense of policing and criminology. I'm going to read to you a quote from a book that he co-wrote with a co-author. And as you hear the words, just remember that this is the person helping to consult Baltimore in its alternative to an over-reliance on policing, in a public health strategy that many have lauded as a progressive alternative to an over-focus on policing. This is the author of Baltimore's GVRS strategy, writing, quote, "The police offer a unique capacity for violence prevention that has no good substitute from other institutions, and effective policing could prevent much of the shooting. The police do not get much respect these days. Some doubt the police departments are even considered with protecting the communities of color that bear the vast disproportionate share of the burden. Widespread demonstrations throughout the summer of 2020 demanded not that the police be reformed, but rather that they be quote-unquote defunded. This bitter attack asserted that gun violence was a public health problem, quote-unquote, and could best be addressed through the methods and perspectives of their field being public health. They, with notable exceptions, have ignored or minimized the role of the criminal justice system," end quote. I understand this stuff can feel a little abstract, but you gotta understand, from my perspective, it's driving me crazy. You have the guy who was instructed on guiding Baltimore's quote-unquote public health alternative to a defense of policing, writing in his book about how we should respect the police, and that defund the police is a bitter attack from people who wrongly believe violence is a public health strategy, and we should focus more on how the police have an indispensable role in violence prevention. Despite the fact that we're quote-unquote down almost 400, 500, 600 cops, and we just cut violence in half over the past couple of years. Braga is not only a criminologist. Of criminologists, he's not even a critical criminologist. Folks who talk about racism and how crime is a social construct, he's not a critical criminologist. He hangs out with explicitly right-wing criminologists. Here's a clip for him talking on the podcast from the Manhattan Institute, a notorious right-wing think tank, with other criminologists basically saying criminology has gone too woke, it's gone too focused on culture and diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we have to recenter it on the hard facts about how great police are. Here's a quote from Anthony Braga on the panel with other criminologists.
So I think to myself, okay, a best practice, comprehensive approach, here's an interesting program that cities could really learn from, and no one's going to get a chance to learn from it because they don't want to fund something that supports the police. As I said, I can go on and on. A major private foundation strangely changed their application requirements. There was a whole new section on the identity of your team members. To which I thought, what does this really have anything to do with, pulling off the research project at hand? I mean, luckily, it didn't hinder us from getting the money.
They exhibit brutality, savagery, and discrimination that are rarely reproduced by officers in economically powerful or predominantly white communities. Now, you could argue about this point. There's evidence one way or the other, but it's certainly not something you can just say as if it's all true, right? I'm proposing something that is about basic science about whether a crime concentrates in city. And what I get back is a kind of ideological whatever about how bad the police are on one level, how they're always brutal and savage, etc. And some nuance to this. There are police that are brutal and savage, etc. But the point is, that's what I get back. And beyond that, I get a criticism of me for having done that work, because I must know how bad the police are, right? And this article was published in a way that started with that as an assumption, like Israel is a genocidal country, etc. Right? And then it goes on to use the same scope to understand policing, right? And talks about the protests, for example, without any mention of the anti-Semitic and violence and things of this sort. Anthony wrote the President of the Society, and the president said, well, we wanted to recognize more conflict criminologists. These are conflict criminologists. Anthony, I think, rightly raised the issue, would you have let this go through if it had potentially offended another minority group? I mean, Jews are a minority group. One of the things we decided not to do is respond to the article. The article is so stupid, to be frank, which I'm happy to be recorded about. The article is so nonsensical, so idiotic, that we didn't want to give it credence by arguing against its arguments.
I know there's a lot in that clip, but the point of it is that when this guy is not around people like the mayor of Baltimore, this is not the person the people of Baltimore are being sold should be the architect of a strategy that's supposedly race conscious of the impacts of mass incarceration. This is not that person. This is a person who clearly has aligned himself with the right-wing criminological response to 2020. So remember, this is the type of person who is being brought into places like Baltimore to evaluate programs like GVRS, to evaluate what those programs should do as like a technical assistance person giving recommendations on how to approach it. When you read other stuff he writes that grassroots violence prevention programs should not be allowed to work without coordinating with police, because if they are allowed to work without coordinating police, they quote-unquote reinforce gang cohesion. I looked up the citation of that article. It's from a guy named Klein, who's writing in the 60s about gang cohesion in Latino gangs in LA in the 60s. And when you read more of what Klein writes, who Braga is citing, he explicitly says some people say that like the Black Panthers and the Black Power movement had basically sucked up the energy from the gangs and redirected it. I don't believe that. He just asserts it. No evidence, no study, no context, no nothing. This is the exact sloppy science that the criminologists are accusing the critical criminologist of. And as opposed to empirically validating their arguments, they completely dismiss it. So when we bring up arguments like the GVRS, they're allowed to go into hospitals, the cops to talk to, i.e. interrogate people when they've just been shot and just been stabbed, and we hear word from people doing violence prevention in hospitals, these GVRS cops make our job harder because they make the violence prevention experts look like cops because we have to come after them. And we can't stop them. They have the right to come in and interrogate people whenever they want. So this whole argument that the police thing makes the violence prevention better and that they have to work together is empirically disproven. You have cities like New Orleans, which tried focused deterrence largely without the violence prevention component, had a drop in crime. When the pandemic hit, it came back bigger and badder and worse than ever. All of the violence declines in New Orleans from focused deterrence were eliminated during the pandemic. And they've only recently declined with the national decline in violence, unlike a city like Newark, New Jersey, which maintained its violence declines because of its multifaceted approach where they focus on grassroots violence prevention. So these people talking about, oh, the woke folks, they have no empirics, they don't care about science. Accusations are confessions. These people, with their ideological commitment to policing, and shockingly enough, their ideological commitment to Zionism, didn't see that coming, are proving that they're not actually caring about the science. And they especially don't have the cultural context to be able to interpret what someone like Baltimore Peace Movement or We Are Us is doing. So why are cities like Baltimore bringing them in to evaluate their violence prevention ecosystems? Because what are they going to say? We Are Us should work more with police. just putting on my Miss Cleo the Psychic hat, my guess is, to the extent like folks Braga come in and evaluate our ecosystem, those are the type of recommendations they're going to bring, which puts more money in policing, which is their ideologically stated commitment to kneecap to defund the police movement. The idea that talking about racial bias in policing, that there's no evidence to assert it, that it's a bidirectional question that can go either way, is just intellectually not serious. But just some examples of that. We know that police deploy their resources disproportionately in black communities. So to the extent that you're using quote-unquote objective data, you're going to get data that reflects police putting more arrests in black communities, which these geniuses therefore assert there's objectively more crime in black communities. Therefore, that's why cops send more police to black communities. Braga tries to get out of this by saying, oh, I'm responding to calls for data, and the police can't control who calls them. So if there are more calls coming from the black community, then that proves that's not bias. It's the people choosing with their calls where the crime is. This shows a level of ignorance to the structure of white supremacy that I think is very telling of people that are trying to perform a level of objectivity but don't really have context for the data they're talking about. We all know that people in suburbs, white people, have a variety of other options that they choose to go to before they call the police. Just think about the school-to-prison pipeline. If you're using the call data from suburban schools, it will quote-unquote objectively show there is less crime in suburban schools and more crime in urban schools. But we know that when you're in these schools, Montgomery County, Walt Whitman High School, people are smoking weed, selling weed, statistically proven. White people use and sell drugs at the same rate as black people. In black neighborhoods, that's associated with the racial caricatures and stereotypes of the black drug dealer and criminal, which institutes a policing response. In white neighborhoods, they have a variety of options. Counseling. They can send you off to the reparative boot camp, moving you to another school. They have a myriad of non-police options that they use, which means they never have to even call the police, so it never gets into that data set. Finally, the idea that there is no similarity between Zionism and policing in places like Baltimore is silly. We've talked over and over again that the former head of AIPAC, Howard Freeman, is on the board of Sinclair Media. Sinclair Media, which recently deplatformed Jimmy Kimmel for daring to make a very tepid joke about Charlie Kirk because they're ideologically aligned with the right wing and Trumpism. Sinclair Media, which is producing propaganda about crime in cities that other people have talked about, not from Baltimore, have said they treat kids in Baltimore a lot like how they talk about kids in Palestine. The images of kids throwing rocks in Baltimore look so much like the kids throwing rocks in Palestine. They mirror the same logic. All they understand is force. They must be deterred. They must be incarcerated. We are incarcerating them from their own good. Their communities have been bombed out and depleted. They need the structure of incarceration to discipline them and turn them into productive citizens. The same logic of preventative incarceration in Israel. It's the same logic of incarcerating and charging youth as adults in America, and we know that the Baltimore Police Department trains with Israeli defense forces. So the idea that there's no connection between Zionism, that they don't even have to respond to the argument. This is a beautiful intellectual technique because the reality is the connection is so clear, you actually don't have a good response to the argument. So you get to not actually go do debate by claiming there's nothing worth debating and turn to an ideologically aligned audience at the Manhattan Institute. The Manhattan Institute is well known for not just supporting stop and frisk, but supporting overt IQ race science. Charles Murray, the bell curve. These are the people who Braga is hanging out with. You can hear the clanking of dishes in the background. This is like a rubber chicken dinner situation. And the guy who was implementing our so-called social justice alternative to mass incarceration is hanging out with these people? It's so bad, and his choices of political alliances are so poor that when the occupation of D.C. happened, the exact same podcast Braga is on, 100 Blocks, the Manhattan Institute, came out not only in defense of the occupation, but explicitly said we should do the occupation in D.C. because D.C. is too focused on operating strategies to solve crime that look too much like GVRS, and explicitly say it's because places like DC have focused too much on social service oriented strategies to policing. Those have failed, which means we need National Guard occupation. Take a listen.
And so I think DC is an interesting national test case of a strategy that we've seen used in other places to be able to say, like, no, actually, there is no legal obligation to tolerate disorder, crime, visible homelessness, public drug use, etc. in these jurisdictions. And in fact, there's an affirmative obligation on the part of superior levels of government to solve those problems. And it's good that they're trying to.
Yeah, in other words, if DC can't keep its own streets safe, the federal government has every right and really every obligation to do it for them.
Right.
This is legal. The president has this authority. You go to Southeast or wherever, you go where the source of these problems are, and it's like stepping into a different world.
And it's entirely voluntary.
Hang out there.
Yeah, I mean, so like, there's an assessment from a couple of years ago. I forget the exact fraction, but it's something like 60% of violent crime in the District of Columbia is attributable to 1,000 people. And the district authorized the study, and they're like, we need to give these people wraparound services. We need to provide them with stuff. We need to make sure. I'm like, you need to put those people in prison forever. Like, that's what you need to do. And the fact that the city won't do it is insane.
What's critical about that clip is, again, this is the podcast that the architect, one of the critical sources of intellectual justification and consultants being brought in to consult on our GVRS strategy. The exact same rhetoric being used to defend GVRS is being used by his friends at the Manhattan Institute to say, you know, those small group of people that are driving violence in the cities, the idea that you should give them services is ridiculous. You should lock them all up. And again, how can you defend against the National Guard occupation when the architect of your strategy that you are citing is the reason you don't need the National Guard occupation? The underlying logic of what is actually driving his theory of criminology, and the friends he hang out with say, your defenses are wrong. We actually do need more police. We need things like the National Guard because your attempt to use social services, despite the fact that it's working, is soft on crime, is a hug-a-sug sort of approach that justifies these violent thugs from preying upon community, and we need to throw them in jail forever. Of course, this will not work. It is a literal conveyor belt. It's how population growth works, where if you lock some people up, more people just come up to take their place. When you lock somebody up, you destabilize community. You destabilize the homes that they were helping to provide for to the extent they're involved in the underground economy. You create a job opening in the underground economy, which then they reach out to other people who are merely adjacent to the street to fill those job openings in the underground economy. So then when that happens, the person who was in jail comes out of jail more traumatized, more hardened, and it gets to compete with the person you brought in as that replacement, thus driving violence. The best studies on this show that mass incarceration and specifically targeted hyper-incarceration in specific communities does not prevent violence. It is the literal driver of violent street crime. So if you care about victims, you care about community, you will not do this lock 'em approach. And more importantly, you will have questions for GVRS. Because GVRS is targeting criminal groups, which means that you're trying to deter violence by one person in the group by threatening sanctions against the entire group. When you read Braga's book, he says things like, yeah, if someone in the group starts beefing, just go to a card game or a gambling session and lock everybody up for gambling. And then say, we hear someone in your group is beefing, tell them to squash the beef. That's not an anti-mass incarceration approach. That's actually a collective punishment approach, which potentially funnels even more people into the purview of the criminal legal system. Again, the conclusion is that the logic that we're trying to use to defeat the National Guard is the exact same logic the defenders of the National Guard are using to justify the National Guard. So whether they come next week, next month, next year, whether they never come, we must fundamentally reject the idea that it is this pathologization of community, viewing them as a disease, a cancer to be excised from the community, or a cancer that can only be cured through white saviors and a so-called elite academic, so-called public health approach, which is really just criminology. We know that now. And center on the successes we've had, so empowering the grassroots cultural and spiritual approaches to violence prevention that do not center police, that do not need police, that work upstream through the entire community, not downstream, specifically on pre-selected subgroups of people that the police have identified, turning violence prevention into a tool of the criminal legal system and justifying police co-opting violence prevention. And frankly, folks like UPenn and Braga co-opting violence prevention into a criminological frame. Because I'm seriously telling you, we should question Brandon and anyone who supports folks like Braga being the standard of what is expertise on violence prevention, because I swear to you, if these are our friends in violence prevention, I do not want to meet our enemies. That's all for this episode of Political Commentary Corner. Again, I'm your host, Lawrence Grandpre, here from Leaders of the Beautiful Struggle. Please like, subscribe, and rate the podcast if you're able to. This is our newest addition to our podcast family. It really helps with the algorithm and really helps us get the word out. Please check us out on lbsbaltimore.com. For the past few years, we've been very explicit about supporting folks like We Are Us, and we're able to do that because the support that we get from folks that give us a small amount of money every month, starting at $10, our monthly sustainers. They allow us to continue to advocate and support groups like We Are Us and Baltimore Peace Movement as they do the critical work of protecting our community, responding to this argument that you can't talk about police accountability and talk about community violence. Our ability to focus on both is because we're not beholden to a grant cycle or a political ideology from anyone except the grassroots communities that power our work and power our perspective and are the true experts, unlike the folks that claim the expertise. So again, lbsbaltimore.com/sustain. There you can check out our other podcast, In Search of Black Power. We take a more national and international perspective on critical issues impacting Black community. Once again, check out all the other podcasts on the Black Liberation Media Network YouTube page and website. We thank you, and we will see you next time on Political Commentary Corner. Take care.